Family Ghost Stories begins now. A family ghost story. This is a story that was related to me by my second cousin, and then the happenings to me and my daughter in later years. My second cousin, who would be in her 90s if alive today, told me her ghost story. When she was in her 20s, she and her current boyfriend were talking about death and being contacted from beyond the grave, and he told her that if anything had happened to him, he would let her know he was okay. She replied, "How?" And he said, "Through a clock." She said okay, and wondered what he meant. 6 months later, he killed himself, and my cousin was so sad she couldn't eat, messed up at work, and had trouble sleeping. She was on the verge of losing her job. That night, when she got home from work, her aunt, who was raising her, told her that the weirdest thing happened. She stated that an old broken clock in the basement kept going and going and wouldn't stop until she put it on the floor and stomped on it. My cousin took this as a sign from the boyfriend, and it helped her to get over her grief. In 1983, my mother died on Christmas Eve. In January, I was going over her belongings. She lived with me and decided to put her alarm clock in my den. It had a lighted dial, and I thought it would be a good idea to keep it on top of the TV. This was before TVs displayed the time at a push of a button. That night, I had a dream, but it was really early in the AM. Possibly still dark. I'm not entirely sure. And the dream consisted of me standing in darkness and a voice telling me I had psychic powers and to use them. At first, I was so scared and refused the gift. The voice was persistent, and so I agreed to having them. People started to appear in my dream, and I ran up to each one telling them of my gift. Then a loud, scary sound started. I woke up and still heard it, and realized it was my mother's alarm clock going off. I got out of bed, went into the den to turn off the alarm button. This old clock had the pin in the back that you had pulled out to let it ring and push and turn it off, in order to turn it off. But when I tried to push it in, I realized it was already pushed in. The alarm was set to go off at 8 a.m. and it was only 3:59. I then realized that it was Mom saying hi. Instead, I yanked the cord out of the wall to make it stop. Years later, in the 90s, after I moved to Florida, my daughter had the alarm clock sitting on her TV, and on Christmas Eve, one of those years, it ran again and the pin was not pulled out at that time either. The clock is wrapped up in a box in storage now. My family home. The story of how I came to live at my current address is a story in itself, but I will briefly outline events. My marriage had come to an end, and I needed somewhere safe for my two sons to live. At the time, they still saw their father, previous ex-husband, to the one I am leaving, who lived with his mother, my son's grandfather. Between them, they offered a place for my boys and me. Odd setup, I know, but as I say, that's a whole nother story. I had only entered the house on a handful of occasions prior to moving in, and had mostly stood in the passageway, and on one occasion, entered the dining room. I was aware that an unhappy family had resided there before my ex's family had moved in, and my ex and his family had a fairly tragic history themselves. On moving in, I immediately felt a heavy and depressing atmosphere in the house. From my early teens, I have been sensitive to such things, and have been aware of presence and or atmospheric changes in many places, both in buildings and on open ground. The house felt overwhelmingly sad and tragic. Due to the events that were taking place in my life, I had a few days off work during this transition. I was a bit of an emotional mess given the circumstances, but I felt blessed as I had been given safe haven by the least likely people to extend the hand of kindness. I was to find the extended hand had quite a different motive in the end, but we live and learn. My ex-mother-in-law was not and never has been a tidy person, so that, coupled with the fact she had been away for a year, leaving her son and daughter, aunt and uncle to my boys, and a friend lodging in the house, I think it's fair to say the house was like something out of Hoarders. I suppose, in part, this was a symbolic to my circumstance, but during my time off, I scrubbed the house from top to bottom. Although it still looked tired and worn, it was at least clean and tidy. This did not make any difference to the general feeling in the house. It was late August when we moved in, and it was now leading up to Christmas 2008. In the few months we had been there, I was already convinced there was some sort of entity in the house, although I did not know what. My ex-mother-in-law was certain something was going on, as odd things had started almost as soon as she had returned from her travels. She returned to the house in March, prior to my moving in during late August. Objects would go missing, the house would be turned upside down, but to no avail. Only for the item to turn up in the exact same spot it was thought to have been left in, days, sometimes weeks later. Pictures would fall off walls, most prominently at the top of the stairs, but throughout the house. TVs and radios would turn themselves on, as would various lights and lamps around the house, and there was a feeling of being watched. I was witness to all of these circumstances, but I would also see a black shadow from the corner of my eye. I didn't feel any of this was evil in any way, simply very sad. That brings us to Christmas Day 2008. I was in the kitchen preparing the veggies for the Christmas dinner. Everyone else was in the living room. The kitchen and living room are separated by the dining room, but you can see through all the rooms from the kitchen door. The kitchen door was open, as it's a small kitchen that gets sauna-like when the oven's on. As I was merrily peeling the spuds, I was suddenly aware of someone behind me. That intuitive feeling we all have from time to time. My current partner tries to sneak up behind me, but I always know he's there, even if I don't see him. It was very much that feeling. I felt and heard breath on my neck, and at that point I started to turn my head around, believing it was my son's father. What I was met with instead was a solid black human shape. Head, shoulders, chest, and arm. I did not look down to see if there were legs. That simply winked out as soon as I had turned around completely, and with it, that feeling of someone being there was gone. I had wholeheartedly believed that I harbored a gut feeling of who was there before this event, but this seemed to cement it for me, and I believe my gut instinct of this being my son's father's brother, who had taken his own life whilst I was carrying my first son. So this would have been 17 years since his passing. My ex-mother-in-law personally took the blame for his suicide, believing she could have helped him more, and had always felt he was still around, and had put his activity down to him. We had discussed this prior to the latest event, and she had finally come to accept that she could not have changed what had happened, which gave her some internal peace, but did not change what was happening in the house. I believe his presence and the overall negativity of the occupants of the house was the cause of all that was going on. With the permission of my ex-mother-in-law, My mother made contact with her departed son, who wanted to tell her he was happy and she had nothing to worry about, amongst other things, but I won't publish them, as they were of a personal nature and not for me to tell. Then a cleansing was performed to expel all of that negative energy. By this time, I should add that my son's father had moved out of the house, so it was just my son's ex-mother-in-law and me living in the house. Soon after, she moved on to pastures new, the United States of America, and we had the house to ourselves. Things still happen, but very infrequently, and the oppressive atmosphere has dissipated. I'm sure it's the boys' uncle checking up on them from time to time. Perhaps it will stop for good once they finally fly the nest.